Can we talk about Bitcoin? What was your first experience with Bitcoin, and when was the sort of light bulb moment for you? I mean, when did you
So I've
see the
had
big
like a
picture?
gradual education on Bitcoin. I first started looking at it, I think it was in '09 or 10, but dismissed it at the time because at the time it felt like it was, even by my standards that are quite high in geekiness, like too geeky at the time. And then started looking at it again, prompted by a good friend in 2012. And at that time, it really hit home. And it's true that even in 2011, 2012, it required a tremendous amount of time investment to truly grasp how fundamental this change was to the world and truly grasp how it worked.
Right.
And at that time, the second time around, I really invested the time in trying to really understand it. And it became—
And you bought in as well?
a little bit, but it became quite evident that at the time, this idea that you could actually be your own custodian, not rely on any third party to not only custody your funds but also move money around, was a revolutionary realization.
Right.
And then I think the sad part about Bitcoin is that it didn't fulfill the medium of exchange piece. It is still fulfilling a very important function as digital gold, or good investment, decorrelated investment asset. But that experience, starting really in earnest in 2012, all the way to now, has definitely enabled me to really think through, okay, what are the roles and the functions that Bitcoin can perform really well?
Yeah.
What are the roles and functions and utility points that it cannot solve?
Right.
And what are the things that we could build that could be additive on top of what currently exists?
So how do you feel when Jack Dorsey sort of complains about your project and points to the permissionlessness of Bitcoin as being a sort of superior sort of intellectual idea to what you're doing? I mean, do you have any sort of understanding of what he's saying?
Well, I think that you should ask him the question. But as far as I'm concerned, there's definitely more openness and more decentralization in the way that Bitcoin operates versus the way that Libra is thinking of operating.
Right.
But I think there's a good reason for it. First of all, I think that it would be hard to recreate Bitcoin right now, which is why I think it's very valuable. Because the set of circumstances that led to what it is today is not recreatable.
Right.
And then I think that if you're talking about not decentralized, decorrelated investment asset, but you're talking about a medium of exchange that is used by hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people, the standard by which you need to operate in terms of anti-money laundering, identity on the platform, and all these things has to be different. And that's just the reality of the world we operate in. And so I do think that Bitcoin and Libra are going to end up being very complementary to one another and serve very different purposes.
Yeah.
But the part which is really hard for me is that I can't see a world where we transition into a place of low volatility and super stability of Bitcoin that enables it to be a great medium of exchange. And that's where the logic breaks for me. And when you think about the use cases of those families that we talked about previously, if you have 10% volatility in one day, which happens regularly with Bitcoin, then you end up with a cost that is actually much higher than the current system to move money around the world because of the volatility it takes. And and again, I think that those things might smooth over time, but the question is, the level of low volatility that is required for an asset to be a great medium of exchange is extremely low volatility.
Yeah.
And I just don't see that happening soon enough. And in the meantime, a lot of people are saying basically the volatility will dissipate on Bitcoin when there are more users and more usage of the network and the asset. But in the meantime, you've got billions of people who need a solution right now. They're not going to wait for 20 years. So, that's why my take is there's a path, there's a solution right now that can be deployed and that can actually serve people in 2020 or in 2021, but hopefully starting in 2020. And that solution will really solve the real problems that the billions of people that are currently unbanked or underserved are faced with.
Right. So I was reading your Twitter profile, and you were talking about a Deal Book conference the other day where Bill Gates was talking, and there was kind of a backlash against Bill Gates, and they were kind of questioning his philanthropic efforts. And I think you had a strong reply, which I found interesting. You said, one can be accomplished, successful, and good. The value system is what brought me here as an immigrant and made me a proud citizen. We must address the wealth gap, but this value system shouldn't be sacrificed. I mean, it sounded to me a bit like you were talking perhaps a little about yourself, even about the Libra project that's kind of why I started with this question at the beginning. I mean, you're doing good, and yet Silicon Valley seems to not be accepted as a kind of good player anymore. This is kind of why there's this backlash.
It's actually an interesting connection point that you made, but that's not why I said what I said. Right. This was coming from a very personal standpoint of seeing a man that has done so much and is doing so much to tackle humanity's greatest issues that no one else has been able to address before he decided to take that on with his personal wealth and intellect.
Right.
And him being attacked just on the basis of the fact that he was a billionaire rather than just judging on his actions, and that's what really got me going.
Yeah. But you would accept the parallels between the two cases. I mean, it seems like this is a billionaire's company trying to do good, and that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't think that those two things. I think, look, I think the problem with Libra has nothing to do with the current world we live in, where people who have been very successful are sometimes ostracized and criticized. I think that the problem here stems from the fact that, again, there's a new project that will enable people to move money around the world with great ease. And at the scale of Facebook that reaches billions of people, there are really good reasons to be concerned about the integrity of the network, about how you protect for downside risks, about how you protect consumers from all kinds of issues that could stem from a network like this. And I think that unlike the first thing that concerned Bill Gates, which I felt pretty passionate about weighing in on, this is legitimate concerns for the most part. And again, it's our duty to address these concerns. So I think, and then of course, there are concerns that are rising from the fact that this project started at Facebook, despite the fact that we're not going to control the network. We're actually not controlling the Libra Association anymore since October. So, I think that all of these things will eventually be addressed with good answers and the way that this thing is actually going to go to market. So I think those two things are quite different, actually.
Okay. Do you have any sympathy or understanding for the kind of critique this is more and more sort of prevailing these days of big tech and Silicon Valley, that it's grown too big, it's got control of too much data? I mean, does that sort of, do you give any credence to that?
Well, I think that we have a great responsibility, and as part of the services that we run, the reach of these services, we have a great deal of responsibility, and we need to live up to these responsibilities.
Do you feel that you've abused that responsibility?
I don't think abused is the right word, but I think that Silicon Valley is a really interesting place where you have a lot of optimism, and a lot of entrepreneurs and creators must have optimism, otherwise they don't end up creating the very companies that we all enjoy services from.
Right.
And because it takes a great deal of optimism to actually suspend disbelief and continue to press on with very hard things to reach these levels. So I think that level of optimism I think was appropriate for a certain age in Silicon Valley, but I think that you can't always hope for the best, and I think that a lot of tech companies have been built on the principles of optimism, and I think that now there's in the last few years there's a realization that you can't only be funneling and channeling the optimism in everything you build, but that you have to act responsibly and always think through what are the downsides of the service that you've created, what are the ways that the service that you've created can be abused, and how can you get ahead of that rather than be reactive after the fact. And I think that's kind of a coming of age, generally speaking, of Silicon Valley, that I think is a healthy and appropriate thing given the maturity of the industry.
So it's a fault of blind faith and over-optimism, is that what you're saying?
No, I think that it's just more of a maturity phase. It's just a different phase for the industry. And look, has happened, and I don't mean to minimize the responsibility and the way that we should have handled things better in the past with some of the issues that we've been under the spotlight for. But in every single industry, you've had that, right? And so cars didn't have seat belts. People used to go through security at the airport with no security. You just used to board planes. There are all kinds of other industries, even in the banking industry. Banking industry has changed completely from the early days where a lot more things were allowed and enabled than what is allowed now. And so I think every single industry has gone through its cycle of maturity, and I think now we in Silicon Valley are in this cycle of responsibility and acting and behaving differently. Right. And I'd say the biggest difference to me, though, is that in every single one of these industries, when there were issues that forced these industries to change, it's not because people were too optimistic about the product. It's because they wanted to optimize their businesses. And I think that's kind of the interesting difference. Silicon Valley and the tech industry in general has always, and to me, and that's why I love this industry so much, has always started from the standpoint of, okay, there's a problem that many people are experiencing around the world, and we are capable of addressing some of these problems and providing tools that will enable people to solve these very problems. Right. And it comes from a great place of optimism and never from a place of we're going to make a lot of money. I mean, I'm not saying never, but I'd say that it's pretty rare for very successful Silicon Valley companies to be optimized around we're going to make a lot of money. It's more we're really passionate about the problem that we need to go fix, and how do we actually do that to the best of our abilities.
So when you were talking to Mark Zuckerberg about this project, you weren't sitting there thinking, how are we going to take over the world and make lots more money? It was...
No, I mean, definitely not.
Right.
And look, I mean, the best proof of this, and I know that it is harder because, again, a lot of the other industries don't operate the same way. It is harder for people to really believe this, but it's the people who are outside of the tech industry. But when you think about WhatsApp, WhatsApp is basically providing free communications, free texting, enabling people to send videos and images, free video conferencing to billions of people around the world. Yeah. And it's still not generating revenues for the company. And so, when you think about that and you think about the time since the acquisition even, this is not the priority. It just turns out that when you build very successful products that have a lot of people using your products because they solve a real problem for them, that eventually you find a path to monetizing those services. But this is not the goal when you start the journey.